It's time to let you in on a little secret. Actually, lots of secrets. We're talking strategy and, most importantly, return on your investment for your podcast. Welcome to Branded Podcast Secrets. Hello and welcome to another episode of Branded Podcast Secrets. I'm your host, Erin Greger, here with another incredible guest. Today, I don't want to say I'm really excited. I always say that, but I am excited. I don't want to discount you of that, Mike. To have Mike Alton here. Mike, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited too, because I know this is going to be a fun topic and we're going to geek out.
Well, and again, we talked about this before I hit record, but it may just be perceived, but looking at you guys, you look like you seem to have your act together when it comes to podcasting. So let me first, for those of you who don't know Mike, he is the head of strategic partnerships at Agora Pulse. Agora is a social media management tool, and they have, if you go check out their stuff, they have quite a few podcasts. So Mike personally is the producer for the Agency Accelerated podcast. They also do the Confessions of a Social Media Manager podcast. We have a couple that are on hiatus, which is the Social Media Lab and the Social Media Lab Live, which we're going to talk about all that. So, Mike, tell us first, why podcasting? And you're doing some lives, you're doing some video, you're doing all stuff. So, obviously, you're in a social media realm, but you guys love some podcasting over there. Can you talk a little bit about why you selected podcasting in so many different avenues?
Yeah, so the why for podcasting itself, I'd say there's two answers. The first is that we understand that not everybody learns the same way. And so when we're creating and providing content in an audio form, that's hitting listeners differently. That's hitting different listeners differently than our written content and our video content. The written content's that's been our bread and butter for years. You know, we get tons of traffic to our blog and our articles and our case studies and so on. But not everybody wants to read. Not everybody wants to take that kind of time. Not everybody wants to search too, right? So that's the other benefit of using podcast as a medium for content. There's discoverability that comes with that platform. You can be on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon and see some show art that catches your eye, or, get referred to or have suggested an episode or a show, some content, right? That you wouldn't have seen that in another way. So that's the why podcasting. Why we have a couple different podcasts. Well, there's backstory, right? But the bigger issue or the bigger goal is to try to hit different kinds of audiences in different ways. So I run Agency Accelerated, which is 100% focused on talking to marketing agencies and helping them with their struggles. Whereas Confessions of a Social Media Manager, that's for social media managers. That's for people who are probably employed, probably the only person doing social media for maybe a larger brand or business. Very different audience, very different interests, concerns, pain points, demographics, and so on. So yeah, we've got a few different shows.
So I'd love to know, because these are work, it's not easy to put a podcast together. Just with your product too, I'm assuming your client, obviously your different demographics very well. Have you found it worth it to do these different, or do you have a demographic where, a lot of times you've got that 80-20 rule where 80% of your income comes from 20% of that demographic? Has it been worth to really focus on these different types of audiences? And are you able to measure that okay, this audience for a social media manager, we know we're still seeing some sort of income on that? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, and the answer is absolutely. For these specific, what we call target ICPs, right? Ideal customer profiles. We have ICPs built for social media managers. We have ICPs built for agencies. And we know as a result, when we create good audio content, that's part of the bar. We can't just create any old podcast. It's got to be good. But when we create, or if we can create great podcast content, we know we're going to reach our audience, and we're able to see that to the metrics. Now, Confessions of a Social Media Manager just launched, so we're not going to be able to really accurately gauge how effective it is for a while. And Agency Accelerated is only a little over 2 months old as a podcast.
Okay.
So we've got a little bit of runway yet to kind of prove the success of these shows. Social Media Lab was around for a couple of years. It's on hiatus right now, but it was extremely effective in our industry, in the niche. People, and here's how I know, people were talking about the podcast outside of podcasts, right? They'd go to a live event and they'd talk to each other about that show. They would cite the show in articles, in listicles of other podcasts, and so on. So we know it was successful there. The question still for us is, what's our next ICP? And should we create a podcast for it? And I'm not sure what the answer is going to be. You know, we have some internal conversations about who else we need to target, who our next ICP is going to be, whether we do a podcast for them or not. I don't know, because like you said, it's a lot of work. and if you were to ask me today to add another podcast to my plate of what I'm doing right now, I'd have to say no, I don't have time for a second podcast personally.
Yeah, no, it is. So, okay, we're going to go into the Social Media Lab in a minute. But before I do, you are all doing a combination, and on all your podcasts, you've got some live, you've got some video. I think it was the Confessions of a Social Media Manager video that I saw. What I would love for you to walk me through that thought process and that strategy as you're planning these out to say, yes, let's do some of these live, let's do some of these just video, let's do some of these just audio, and how you're making those decisions.
Yeah. So with Confessions of a Social Media Manager, I believe they're using the same platform as you, Riverside. So they're creating video, but their goal at the end of the day was to build a wonderful podcast. So the video is a byproduct of that goal. Is to, you know, they want to create a great podcast. With Agency Accelerated, we have a video first strategy where at the end of the day, we want amazing content, and the podcast is part of that. But we're also creating great content for our YouTube channel. We're also creating great content for our social channels, because since we start with video first, we use Ecamm as a studio and then Restream to push that out to Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We're able to take video snippets out of it, which you and I know that's more compelling. There's a reason why great podcasts will take snippets from the podcast and spin them into audiograms, right? Which are essentially just videos. But because most podcasts just record the audio, they don't actually have true video content. So they create a semblance of a video with a graphic and a waveform. But the social networks see that as a video file. It's uploaded as an MP4. So when we start with video first, and we have a great interview, like we talked to Jarek Robbins a few weeks ago on Agency Accelerated. That's the son of Tony Robbins, the world famous, globally well-renowned. Jarek's not as well known as his dad.
Recognize the last
name, but that's
name.
okay.
Yeah,
You recognize the last name. And the cool thing about Jarek is he learned from his dad, and he embraces the fact that his dad's who he is. And he's just as powerful of a motivator and speaker as his dad. So we had an amazing conversation with Jarek about things like the difference that makes the difference in each of our businesses. And so we're able to take that video of him saying that, talking about what makes the difference that makes the difference in your video. Are you talking to your clients about what do they really want? Are you giving them what they want, and so on? And we're able to share that to social channels. And we do two things. First, because it's a video file, like I already talked about, it triggers the algorithms in a positive way. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they want video content. But the second thing that happens that an audiogram can't do is you get to watch this video as a viewer, and you get to see Jarek. Not just hear his voice, but you see his face, his expressions, his hand movements, his eye contact, and it's more engaging. It just is. So we start with that. At the end of the day, we want great teaching moments. And the podcast is really where we're leaning into like polishing that stuff, right? Because the YouTube video is really just the raw live interview. And the podcast, you know, I spend countless hours editing and polishing that. But we start with video for those reasons.
Okay. No, I agree with you too. I always tell people, you know, especially on social media, the actual video snippets versus an audiogram. Like if you have a video podcast, don't even bother with the audiogram where that's just the waving. It's cute, it's awesome, but you're going to get way more engagement on the video. And I bet you guys have a ton of actual data. This is just my opinion and some data. I guess you guys have probably a ton of data to back that up. But I
Right.
want to talk about how you guys are structured at Agorapulse, because it's really interesting
Mm.
as you talk about the other podcasts. You're like, well, they're using this, you're using something different. So how does it work? Like, how are you guys, if you kind of are in like maybe your own separate verticals, do you connect as team, like a podcasting team, like to kind of talk about strategy, or is it very separate at your company and how these podcasts are getting run?
Oh, we're kind of poking the bear here, aren't we?
Well, say what you need to. Just we can always edit.
Let's
We
talk
can
about
always
how
edit.
dysfunctional we are.
No,
No.
no.
What happens in Agorapulse is that we have a marketing team, but we also have some few specific regional teams, starting with France, because we're based in Paris, which is just as magical as it sounds. So we have a French team, and we have a German team, and we have a UK Ireland team. And we're in the process of developing an Asian Pacific team. And
Wow.
those teams have like regional coordinators, and as they grow, they had support, they had sales, they had social media, community, and so on, so that they become kind of their own little functional teams. And so there's a lot of benefit to that, but then there's challenges, right? Because then as an individual team, I think I should do this for my community. And I talked to my immediate boss, and he says, yeah, it's a great idea. So then we start doing it. And sometimes there's a disconnect and not as much communication trickling throughout the entire company, that each team is doing what they're doing. So a lot of times, like, and this is a great example with the podcast, we'll find out a little bit further down the road what other teams are doing. And it's just then incumbent on us to see where else we can help. Here's the example. I just went through 3 weeks of consulting with a podcast consulting company, Podspike. And they're giving me all kinds of tips, and we're hyper focused on Agency Accelerated, right? What's my message? What's my mission? What's our unique selling point? What are we doing with each episode? What are the key takeaways for our audience, and so on? And I'm thinking about it all from that specific lens, but I'm also taking lots of notes. And once I've kind of digested for myself and my podcast, basically, what were the learnings from those consulting sessions, I'm going to synthesize all that and give it to the UK team and say, here's what this outside consultant was saying about the Agency Accelerated podcast. This might help you, right? Are you doing these things? They were suggesting that you really think hard about whether your podcast is entertaining, informational, or educational. And when he put it that way, as an example, he made a distinction between informational and educational, which I'd never really thought of before. But if I'm really thinking back hard to the episodes we put out so far, I have to admit, they're really more informational. They're really more them, the guest or the host, just telling you, not showing you.
Interesting.
And so the UK team can take that, and they can think, well, what do we want to be? I mean, not that there's anything wrong with informational, but if you want it to be educational, that means at the end of the day, at the end of each episode, your listeners should know how to do something different than at the beginning of the episode. So that's how things are working today. We're just looking for ways to collaborate. We have a marketing retreat coming up, which I'm really looking forward to, because we haven't been able to get together, obviously, because of the pandemic. As a full company, we're a global distributed company, and that makes it harder to collaborate as teams. And so our retreat in January, I think, hopefully will help address a lot of those kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's well, and I, to be honest with you, we'd laugh about it, but this is the issue of every company that's more than 10 people, right? It's like, okay, well, we want to be able to do certain things, but who owns that? Who runs that? How does that work? I mean, it is a very common question. And another common question I want to talk about is, so before we hit record, you talked about Social Media Lab being on a hiatus because the person who was running that had left. Now, this is a common question too with companies, like, who's going to host the show? Who's going to run the show? Who's going to take this? And what happens if that person leaves and they're the voice of your company and people are, this is their show, but it's your show. And how does that work exactly? So how has that been something your company has been working with, because you had a very like I was telling you, I'm like, I listened to some episodes and I downloaded it. How has that affected you as a company, and you shifting to that plan B, how has that worked out for you guys? I know you're still in that shifting process, but I would love for you to talk through a little bit of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not a problem that's unique to us. It's not a problem that's unique to podcasting.
No.
I mean, anytime you have an organization, a project, an initiative where there is an individual at the forefront of that thing, whatever that thing is, like it could be a church, right? If you've got a very charismatic pastor and they leave the church, that's going to cause a lot of friction, a lot of disruption, a lot of confusion and unknown as to, okay, what do we do next, for both fans and the people running it. So in our case, a couple things. The podcast itself was no longer going in the direction we wanted it to go. And so we made a choice to part ways with the person who was running it at the time.
Okay.
The mission of the podcast was to run experiments on social media to give our audience real, tangible data. Like we talked about data, right? You don't have data on this, but we maybe do, right? On the use of video on social media. That was his job, was to come up with experiments. What's better, audiograms or actual, moving face video snippets? That'd be a great experiment, right?
Yes.
And he did so many of those so well, where he'd come up with an hypothesis. He'd run the experiment on multiple channels over a course of time. Then he'd just report back the results. Hey, we found that audiograms got 10% less engagement and 20% less views. Ooh,
Need
that's
to know
really
that,
cool,
yeah.
actionable advice, right?
Yep.
But then, pretty much along the time of the start of the pandemic, he got away from that. Started leaning into live video, started leaning into live video interviews, and really strayed away from actionable advice based on real-time experiments that had been run by us. And the problem was, not that the live interviews and that kind of format was bad in and of itself, but we could see from the data that's not what was resonating with the audience.
This is so interesting.
So when your downloads are going down, when your traffic is going down, because that was the whole point, is to have a blog with the podcast embedded, right? When the traffic's going down and now you're not getting the traffic and you're not getting the trial signups and the subscriptions, it's not making money like it used to. And that's the point of the show. That's a problem.
I love that it was so clear to you guys, though, of what this was initially and what you were trying to do with it initially. This is like, like how many companies don't have that clarity in what they're creating in a podcast to know that, A, this is what this is supposed to be. This is exactly what we're trying to, what this is going to be. And B, this is exactly how we can measure not just downloads, but vanity is wonderful, right? But how are those downloads equating to subscriptions and all of this different stuff? How do you guys measure that specifically from this podcast? Like, you got 100 new subscriptions yesterday, right? You know that the podcast was either the reason for 50 of those, or, maybe a good reason of 20. How do you guys set up that measurement? Because this is the biggest struggle I see companies have when it comes to podcasting.
Oh, yeah. So I'll preface this by saying there will always be a segment of your audience that you can't measure.
Right.
They hear the name of your business verbally, and they choose not to click anywhere, but to just go to your website through their phone or their desktop. And you don't know how they heard about you. But what we did with the podcast, what we did with Agency Accelerator is the same thing. Two things. We have a specific link that we audibilize during the podcast.
Okay.
That is unique to the podcast. So if someone goes to that link, we know it was as a result of listening to the podcast. There's nothing else pointing to it. It's not part of regular blog posts. It's not shared to social or email or anything like that. So we know everybody who subscribes from that specific landing page It's from the podcast.
Yeah.
It's easy. With Agency Accelerated, I drive them into a webinar. With Agency Accelerated, it's much more top of funnel, where we're not really talking about Agorapulse in Agency Accelerated. We're just talking about how to grow your agency. So I might have an episode about growth mindset. So every episode, what we're doing is we're not asking them to subscribe. We're asking them to sign up for a webinar that is related to the content. And we're using a bit.ly link, and we don't share that anywhere else. So again, same deal. We know if you went to that bit.ly link, we know if you sign up for the webinar, you came from the show.
Yeah.
That's easy. Then we also have the show site itself. We have the social media lab, all the content there, which is very siloed. We know all the traffic that comes to that content. We know all the subscribers that come out of that content. And we bring it into Data Studio, and we can see, hey, that content has generated $60,000 in recurring monthly revenue, which is amazing. That's fantastic. Now, I will say real quick, to take full ownership, the guy who was running the lab, he reported to me. Now, he started before me. They started the lab before I joined Agorapulse. But for a long time, I was his manager. And so I was there last year when he was making the decision to do live interviews. I was part of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
And part of the reason was the company saying, hey, we need more downloads. We need more traffic because we want to result in more sales. That was the thought process. And that was a mistake by us, by the company. So I don't want to put it all on the guy who was hosting it. We should have been leaning more into better quality content. If we could create even better experiments, that would have led to even better podcast episodes. You don't need to have more podcast episodes. Just more and more and more isn't necessarily going to give you the results you want. That was a hard lesson for us to learn.
But what a great lesson to learn, though, from A, to know that, again, the measurement of being able to say this isn't working, and B, everybody, like, it's a very, like, Gary Vee will tell you content, you know what I mean? And Gary Vee is like the almighty when it comes to social or content and social media. It's like, just create. But to your point, that, you know, maybe 5 more episodes isn't going to get you what you need if people start tuning out because the 4 episodes they heard, yes, that one may be amazing, but if the other 4 or 3 or, you know, whatever aren't that great, well, when it became I need to listen to this week's episode, it may not be as important to them. And so I love that you guys, A, are willing to make that mistake, but also B, I think, willing to experiment with it too, because I think that's the one thing I love about podcasting is there is no rule and necessarily, right? Like, it is still an experiment. And for each company, what I say works really well for me may not work for your audience or may do that. So, as you were going through this process, like, at what point was it to say, you know what, this isn't working? And was it just download numbers, or was it something else you guys saw where you realized we made a mistake?
Yeah, it was probably middle of this year. So it was a few months ago. And at that point, the social media lab had fallen under a new department. So I was becoming totally focused on partnerships. That really is my job, partnerships with other brands, influencers, and so on. And we're building a new community, social media pulse community. And the lab was going to fall under that. And they were having conversations with the gentleman running the lab about the direction it was going and what they were looking for. And part of it was just the nature of the content was no longer filling the mission of the lab. And then part of it was certainly the metrics.
Yeah.
That particular kind of content was super easy to measure. There's the vanity metrics you mentioned of downloads, but there's traffic to the actual recap posts or experiments. And one of the things I should say is the very first, I don't know, 20, 40, 50 episodes, they started as a long form blog post.
Interesting.
That mapped out the entire experiment. The podcast was a discussion about the experiment.
Ooh, I love that.
Okay.
That's a great idea.
It was with the host and another guy on our team who truly had a voice for radio. And so if you go back to some of those early episodes, you'll hear Richard, who's no longer with the company either for other reasons. He just had found other opportunities. So the two of them had conversations about the podcast. And then, things changed over the last year to 2 years, and it never really found a good direction to go. And that's what I was saying. They started to have conversations with the host, and he wasn't interested in trying to find a new direction that was either closer to the original mission or just in a different direction that would see positive results.
Yeah. So interesting. I thank you for your honesty too, in saying, we messed up and we tried something and we thought it was going to work one way and it just didn't, because I think that's what business is. If anybody tries to tell you they've got it all right the first time, they're lying. There's no other way about it.
Yeah. I'll give our CEO a shout out, because Emmerich, our CEO, has a really good mind for culture and vision. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things he'll always tell me is, I don't care, in his French accent, I don't care if you make mistakes as long as you're learning. Mm-hmm. And he encourages us to test, to experiment, to explore, as long as we come out of it with a learn, and then we change.
Exactly.
Right? We can't keep doing the same mistakes. We've got to figure out, okay, well, what went well, what didn't, and then pivot and learn and improve and adjust from there. That's a cultural thing that you're right. That's not in every business. Not every leader has that kind of vision to know, if I want to grow my business to 50 million annual revenue, I can't keep doing the same things that I'm doing today that's only got me to 5 million.
Right.
I got to do something different.
Yeah. 100% agree. So I would love to talk about too, again, the way you speak. Congrats if it's kind of a shit show behind the scenes, because you really seem to have it together. But I loved how you talk about your funnel and understanding where exactly in the funnel, at each podcast can be different of that funnel. For you specifically as head of strategic partnerships, obviously exactly where the funnel is from the agency accelerator perspective, but as the producer of that show, how are you using it to create partnerships too for your company? Because it has to help your job somewhat, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Otherwise, you're just
justifying my existence.
You have a life-sucking hobby happening right now. Other than that,
yeah, pretty much. No, that's exactly right. So there's two things that are happening. The first is that some of our show guests are partners.
Okay.
Our next upcoming, I don't know when this will drop, but one of our next episodes is with Wave.video. They make short video snippets, perfect guests for podcasts and agencies who want to create video quickly for their clients and so on. It's a great tool. They're a brand partner, which means they understand the expectation that they are going to share their episode. I mean, everyone listening, if you run a podcast and you've got a guest on the podcast and they're just somebody you invited to be a guest interview, they're under no obligation to share your podcast.
Yeah.
If you're doing your job as a host, you'll thank them after the show and you'll give them all the assets. Maybe you'll even give them click to tweets if you really, and you might even go so far as to ask them, hey, will you share this with your audience? They're still under no obligation to do it.
No.
But when I bring a brand on, that's different.
Interesting.
They understand going into it, because I've said it up front. I said, hey, we'd like to partner with you on this show. We'll promote you if you'll promote us. I use different language, but that's basically the tacit understanding that they are going to share it.
Yeah.
So that's the first purpose. Some of the show guests, our very first show guest was the CEO of Visme. Visme's a big graphic design company. They've got like 1 million Twitter followers. They share it all the time. They retweet our shares of their show episode all the time because we made them look good.
Yep.
Right? I mean, this is one of our key tenets as a show host, right? Make the guest look good. I made Visme look so good. I let him do a 20-minute demo of his tool on our channel. So they're appreciative of that.
Yeah.
And they share it. Second thing, for some guests, maybe they're not a partner yet. And I use the show as an avenue for building a relationship with them, which might someday, if everything works out, become a relationship.
Yep.
Give you an example. You've probably heard of Adobe.
Maybe once or twice. I recognize the name.
Yeah, it's a household
Yeah.
name. I have no relationship with Adobe. We don't have a partnership, but I would love one. And it makes a lot of sense in a lot of different ways. So I reached out to one of their employees, their head of global customer advocacy, reached out to him on LinkedIn and said, hey, I've got a show called Agency Accelerated. Could we talk to you? Would you like to be a guest? And one of the things that I did in early 2020 is I actually changed my LinkedIn job title. I mean, I had approval from my boss. But I changed the job title and the focus of my LinkedIn and really made it all about Agorapulse and the partnerships that I create. My title beforehand was brand evangelist, which doesn't mean anything to anybody.
It really
Nobody knows
doesn't.
what that means.
No.
Now, yeah, but head of strategic partnerships, that sounds kind of cool, right?
Yeah.
It didn't bring me any more money, so there was no raise
It
involved.
sounds way cooler though. That's all that's important.
It sounded good, and the point was, if I approach the CEO or the VP of marketing or the CMO or the head of strategic partnerships at another brand, they're going to read my title. They're going to see my experience. They're going to see my cover photo and everything, and understand, at least at a better level, what it is that I do and what I can bring to the table. So I started doing that and started reaching out to other brands like Adobe. I have the vice chairman of Ogilvy is going to be on the show next quarter. Ogilvy is the most famous, biggest agency in the world.
Yeah.
We're blessed to have them as a customer, but beyond that, we've never done a whole lot with them. So I reached out. And the funny thing was, here's the funny story. The vice chairman of Ogilvy UK, his name is Rory Sutherland. And Rory is a brilliant author, TEDx speaker, keynote speaker. He's a paid speaker. The man is a genius. And I just love the way his mind thinks about marketing. And I thought, well, first of all, it took me a while just to find his email. And I thought there's just no way he's going to say yes to anything for me, right? But first of all, I knew he was in the UK. So I adopted a little bit of UK language. And I put as my subject line, I have a cheeky request. And so that got him to open it.
That's awesome.
Right?
Yeah.
He opened it, and then I was very complimentary, very specific. I demonstrated that I knew who he was, I knew what he'd done. I've been reading his book Alchemy and loved it, and I said, and you guys are a customer of ours. I would really love to have you on our show in Q1. And he said, yes, absolutely. In fact, he copied his assistant and said, hey, book it. So that worked really, really well. So that is the secondary purpose of the show from my perspective, my personal, position in the company perspective, is to foster relationships with influencers or other brand partners that we might want to work with in the future.
Yeah. And I would love, so I for lack of a better term, pick your brain on this one, because there's all right, I opened the door through a podcast, and you see a lot of people being able to do that, right? Where you come on my podcast, you get that door opened. Do you have a secret sauce of follow-up on, obviously there's here's the collateral, share it, thank you. Yeah. But even beyond that, once you've opened that door, is there a way that you foster those relationships that you're willing to share or talk about to really continue that path just outside of the recording of the podcast?
Yeah. Well, you touched on the first part that's so important, is that there is a follow-up, right? So I have an email that I send every guest after their episode, thanks them profusely for their time, and I give them assets that continue to make them look good, right? We do snippets, video quotes, quote graphics, and in fact, one of the things that this consultant suggested that I thought was brilliant, he said, if you're going to do 3 video snippets, usually we'll do like a quote where they're saying something really smart, but it's for the benefit of the agency owner who's watching. He said, for that third one, instead of just some other random quote from the show, find the point where they're talking about what they're working on. Oh. Maybe they've got a new book coming out. Maybe they've got a group community that they've started or a new product feature. Find that and give them that, because they will absolutely share that, right? So we're going to be doing that going forward. I said, that's genius.
That's a great idea.
And then, so then after that email, well, here's the other thing too. Depending on who it is, if it's an influencer, for instance, like a social media marketing influencer, someone who teaches, who's got a big community of people who are following them to learn more about social media, and I haven't already been working with them, I offer them a free, no strings attached subscription to our tool, AgoraPulse. Say, hey, I don't know if this can help you out, but I'd love to gift you complimentary AgoraPulse.
Yeah.
And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say yeah, sometimes they don't say anything. It just depends on the individual. Because I recognize, first of all, they might already have a relationship with a tool in our space.
Yeah.
And secondly, they might be so ingrained with their existing workflows and processes that just the idea of changing might give them a headache. And that's fine. But many times they'll say, yeah, that'd be fantastic. My team was just asking me about a new tool, and I'm like, okay, great. Well, the timing's perfect. And then we get to watch and see, do they use it? Do they love it? Do they come to me with questions? Do they want to schedule a call? Which is the ideal next step is, let's get on a 30-minute call and I can answer your questions. I can show you. I'm not on our support team or a sales team or anything like that, but I've been using AgoraPulse for years. And I guarantee you, I can show you things that you're not even going to see on the homepage, tricks and tips, and you can tell me what you need with social media today. And I can tell you how AgoraPulse can help you save time doing it. And those are the opportunities that I'm looking for. Like I was on a call with an influencer named Rebecca Radice. She's a longtime friend, but I was on a call with her and she was telling me she used to work for a different competing tool that I don't even know if they exist anymore. But one of the things she loved about that tool was that it had different buckets for images, videos, and text. And so you could schedule different kinds of content different ways. And then it allowed her to create a structured Facebook page cadence of posting, which is really smart, right? You mentioned Gary Vee. That's his jab, right hook approach. Right. You do a motivational quote, and you do an inspirational thing, and then you give them the link to your ebook. It works. So and she's like, and I'm kind of frustrated. I can't really do it as easily with AgoraPulse. And I said, oh, but you can. We have cues, and you could just name these cues whatever you want. You can name the cue image, text, video, set up your schedule, and it's now even more flexible than your past tool because you can name it whatever you want, set up whatever schedule. So all that's to say, I was able to give her what you just did, that light bulb moment. And if you can do that for a potential partner, give them that kind of a moment. Now they're feeling gratitude towards you. And so then the next step for me is usually to come up with something to do that's in their wheelhouse. Easy example is I've got summits. So if I have somebody who's on the live show and they're on the podcast and they're fantastic, well, when Q2 runs around and it's time for me to do my annual agency summit, I'm going to tap them to be a speaker. I'm going to say, hey, Jarek, can you come run a workshop in our summit? And again, you make them look good, but when they're involved in that kind of event, they're even more likely to share it. You can give them the emails and all the templates to share it with their audience and grow, as a result, your audience. That's what we do.
Mike, I hate that we're running out of time because I have I could just have another hour with you. So much to learn, so much great advice in here. Thank you for sharing everything you've shared. And like I said, the honesty too. So I'm going to throw this at you. I don't know if you want to offer it, but if there's any offer that you have for our listeners to try out AgoraPulse, like I told you, I keep on saying Agora Plus, but AgoraPulse, is there any place that they can go to check out your product and learn more about how they can use it and what you guys are about?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is if you're listening and you're a marketing agency or an agency of any kind and want to do more marketing, I'd love to hear what you think about our podcast. So you can go to agorapulse.com/agency accelerated.
Okay.
And that's our brand new show site. It actually just launched this week. So I haven't really shared that anywhere.
Ooh,
but you'll see all of our past dozen episodes or so are there. The second thing, to answer your question, if you go to agorapulse.com/Alton, ALLTON, that's my last name. If you go there, there's a coupon code there to get your first 2 months free after your trial.
Oh.
We have a 30-day trial like everybody else. It's a 15-day trial, and then you can renew it for another 15 days. But after that, if you subscribe to a monthly plan and you put in the coupon code on that landing page, you can get your next 2 months totally free. So 3 months free total.
Okay. Awesome. And of course, all that'll be on our notes page over at eringregor.com. So we'll make sure to include all that. Thank you, Mike, so much again. I really appreciate this and amazing information. And like I said, I really appreciate your honesty today, too.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.